And this brings us to vitamin D. It's a completely different situation here. Vitamin D is mainly a problem in northern countries, where we are living, for example, and even up north, it's even worse because vitamin D is necessary for being activated by sunlight. And so you need UV light in order to activate vitamin D. And if the sun is not there, or the sun is there but it's not really powerful, like here in the wintertime, for us the sun is not really very strong, it could be that the conversion of vitamin D into the active component is not taking place, and in those situations you get deficiency. It can happen with young children, especially young children who are not placed in the sun because their skin is very sensitive and they will always be covered as much as possible. They will be indoors, so you don't have much opportunities to produce vitamin D. And the second target group is, of course, the elderly, because also they, here in our countries, will not go out that much, stay indoors, are not in contact with sunlight. The sunlight is also not so strong, so they also have problems with vitamin D deficiency. You can see on this slide how the structures look like. Important to know is that we have two precursors of vitamin D, and we call them ergosterol on the left side, and we call them dihydrocholesterol on the right side. The left one is plant-based, the right one is animal-based. Most of the vitamin D we get in is animal-based, for example, in milk, in liver, in fatty animal foods like fish, for example. Fatty fish will contain vitamin D. And for the plant-based, it's a bit more difficult to search for them, but you do have plants that are rich in vitamin D. A good example is uh, mushrooms. So mushrooms are perhaps not the classical plants that we know about, but you can produce them quite easily, and they do contain increased quantities of vitamin D. So they are a source of vitamin D for our problem. When these precursors are taken in by the diet, they are absorbed, they go actually to the skin, and they are stored subcutaneously, where they can be in contact with UV light. And then you see for both situations that UV light will convert them by opening the ring structure. And this ring structure is ring structure number B in the middle. It's a radical reaction. It will open up, and then you produce the next compounds, which is ergosterol and cholecalciferol. So these compounds are now produced. On the left side, it's vitamin D2. On the right side, it's vitamin D3. And then you can have the conversion of D2 into D3. This happens by a reduction, and this is mainly the side chain that contains a double bond, which will be saturated in this case. So in this case, you get vitamin D3, cholecalciferol, and this one is now going to the liver, where you get a hydroxylation at position 25. And then it goes to the kidneys, and in the kidneys you have a hydroxylation at position number 1. So the final product you get is 125 dihydroxycholecalciferol. A very complex name, but this is the real activated compound. And so the example I give you here on the slide is a perfect example of bioconversion. So you don't have to know the chemical formulas, but I do want you to know the different compounds, because it's an example of bioconversion and it has many problems in human nutrition today. So in order to have activated vitamin D, you need to bioconvert your precursors into the activated form. And this form is then transported by the blood going to the intestinal wall, and at the level of the intestines, it will activate the absorption of calcium. It will do that by interaction with the genetic material. You will produce calbindine, which is a transport molecule for calcium, and in this way you can absorb more calcium by the intestines. So this is the key role of vitamin D in the human body. What happens then is although it looks complicated, it is not, because you already know that from the calcium metabolism. If we are in low calcium status, we call that a hypocalcemia, to low levels of calcium in the blood. You get the release of a hormone, which is called parathyroid hormone. You have more release of phosphorus by the urine, and you have the activation of the hydroxylase that codes for the synthesis of the activated vitamin D3. So at the level of the kidneys, the final hydroxylase is added. So you get 1,25-dihydroxycholecalciferol. This one goes to the small intestine. There you have the absorption of calcium. And at the same time, you have more mobilization of calcium and phosphorus from the bone. And we know that from previous lectures. So in this case, you can restore the original calcium levels in the blood. Second option, hypercalcemia, too much calcium in the blood. In this case, another hormone will play a role, which is calcitonin. You will have calcium diuresis, which actually means that there is more calcium loss in the urine, and you have less activity of 25-hydroxy-dehydroxylase. So you don't activate vitamin D, so it means you don't have any absorption of calcium in the small intestine. And the bone mobilization will be increased, so in this case, calcium and phosphorus can be incorporated into the skeleton to produce more bone. So the 1,25-dihydroxycholecalciferol works by acting with the vitamin D receptor. This is happening in the nucleus. As a result of that, there is a synthesis of the calcium binding proteins. Calbindine is the calcium binding protein in the small intestine, and prolactin is a vitamin D interacting protein that mainly interacts with breastfeeding. So I hope with this it gives you a little bit an idea on how vitamin D works and how important bioconversion is. So it could physically be there, the precursors could be there, but if we don't convert it because there's no sunlight or there is no efficiency in conversion like in elderly, in those situations you get a deficiency. So let's look a little bit on the intervention for vitamin D. How do we do that? So I give the example for Belgium because we had a very nice study which was called the VitaDex study, done a couple of years ago by one of our PhD students. It was Isabelle Moyersoen, who is now working for Governmental Institute in Brussels, who is actually coordinating the food consumption trials in Belgium. So they're actually looking, for example, for vitamins. Is there an excess intake? Is there a low intake? Are there some target groups we should look at and interfere? So she's doing a very practical work now that is still linked with vitamin research. So in her PhD, she was actually looking at vitamin D, and here you get one of the tables that give you an idea for the situation in 2017, which is about 5-6 years ago, for the Belgian case. So we talk about men here between the age of 18 and 39 years old, so young adults. You see 4 sources by which the vitamin D comes in. So either by the food, either by mandatory fortified foods. A good example is margarines. Margarines are an alternative product for butter. Butter contains, from a natural point of view, vitamin D. So the producer of margarines, which are plant-based foods, needs to add vitamin D to the margarine to compensate for that. And that's called a mandatory fortified food. Voluntary fortified foods, there you don't have to add it. You can if you want, but you don't have to. The example is breakfast cereals. If you take breakfast cereals in Belgium, in many cases, vitamins have been added, including vitamin D. And then the last option is supplement use, whereby you supply supplements of vitamin D to the population. The third column gives you the intake that derives, and you see the intake levels going up as soon as you add the contribution from mandatory foods, voluntary fortified foods, and supplements. And the mean value that you get is between 3 and 6 micrograms per day of vitamin D. And the adequate intake, the intake that could normally cover the requirements for 100% of the population, can be seen on the right of the table, and this is 15. Usually it's fluctuating between 10 and 15 micrograms per day for our country. So it actually means that even if we have all 4 interventions there, it's still not enough to meet the current recommendation. So in other words, we could say that vitamin D stays a little bit a problem mutant in our country today. You see, of course, that there are quite some variations around the mean values. This is because there's a distribution of intakes, and it can fluctuate, for example, for the supplement use between 4 and 12 micrograms per day. But even if we take into account this variability, we still have difficulties with reaching the adequate intake for the majority of the population. If we go to sensitive target groups, then you can see here a curve that actually plots young infants. The first two between the age of 0 and 6 months, then the third and the fourth are between 7 and 11 months. Then we have the toddlers, and then the pregnant women and the lactating women. And so these are the all, let's say, sensitive groups that need follow-up. And you have 4 colors of the bar graphs, which correspond to the 4 targets that we discussed before. So the first one is the food, then the mandatory fortified foods, the voluntary fortified foods, and the supplements. So if we take the first one, so on the y-axis you can see the vitamin D intake in micrograms per day. We need between 10 and 15 micrograms per day, I already explained. And if you would go into the area of 25 to 40 micrograms per day, then we have too much. So in those situations, you get into potential calcification, which means that there's too much vitamin D circulating, which can also give disturbances in the calcium metabolism. And so we need to be careful with high dosing. So what do we see if we take the first one, which is children between 0 and 6 months that are breastfed? Then you see that nothing is coming in by the food, nothing is coming in by mandatory and voluntary fortified food. So the only option here to have enough vitamin D intake by the young child who is breastfed is the use of a supplement. By using supplements, you can get into the range of 10 to 15 micrograms per day. And since the deviation is so big, with this gray bar graph, it also means that in Belgium, some children do not take any supplements and other ones do. If we go to the second one, which is from 0 to 6 months, which are bottle fed, in those situations, you see that the red and the green bars are also rising. So it means that in the mandatory fortified foods, bottle fed, there is the presence of vitamin D. And so if you don't breastfeed, but you do give bottle feeds, you have a little bit an advantage because in those bottle milks, there is already vitamin D present. And so which compensates, which gives you about 10 micrograms per day. So in principle, for those children, it is not necessary to take an additional supplement. For 7 to 11 months, it's a little bit a similar situation. So you see, very careful there again, the foods is not supplying anything unless you give them the bottle fats, because there you have extra supply of vitamin D. And the supplements will only be relevant in this case for the ones that are only breastfed. For the toddlers, similar situation. There you can see that toddlers can also already start taking other types of foods. So probably you could take foods that are voluntary fortified, for example, so that they can get extra vitamin D from there. And then there you don't need to take any extra supplements. For the pregnant women, again, the supplements might be beneficial. If you go for the lactating women item, so also there it could be useful for an extra supplement. So you see, vitamin D is not really optimized yet in Belgium. So they are working on some technologies to see what could be sustainable and could be the most optimal way of working. And there are software programs. And so Isabel published one paper in 2018 on it. I think there's also a paper of her in the Eufora website if you want to see more details. I just want to highlight how the program works. So it's a simulation program whereby on the y-axis you see all types of codes, and these codes correspond to some types of foods that are fortified with vitamin D. And so with the program you can play around, you can just pick out a number of foods, you can add vitamin D and see the effect for the population. On the x-axis, you can see the percentage of people that are either deficient, which is on the left side of the zero line, or either in excess, which is on the right side of the zero line. And the zero line itself corresponds with the recommended amount. So if you are on that line, it means that you have the optimal vitamin D intake. If we take the bottom as a first case, BC on the right side, on the left side here, means breakfast cereals. So it means if we would fortify all the breakfast cereals in Belgium with vitamin D, then you see that the majority of the target groups, all the colors are linked to age groups, you can see that the majority of the target groups is still deficient. So it means that breakfast cereals is probably not the ideal matrix because not many people are really consuming it. A small amount of people, also on the right side of zero, might be in problem because they get too high intakes. And so they are probably very highly consuming breakfast cereals. And so with the program, you can start combining and looking at scenarios, and you can go up the curve. And at a certain moment, you can see here that the curve perfectly fits the zero line. So all these combinations at that moment actually will give you an ideal intake of vitamin D for the Belgian case. And the first on the list there is bread. So if we would add vitamin D to bread, we will probably reach a high level of people because many people are consuming bread in this country. So with these simulation programs, you can actually predict what could be the most ideal intervention in order to solve a vitamin D problem in Belgium. Okay, so that is about vitamin D. So I hope that you understand for the two fat-soluble vitamins, both of them are very crucial. Both of them have problems with different target groups. We have solutions, but the solutions in all cases are not optimized. And so there's always somewhere a problem that still needs to be looked at further in the future. So now I come to my third vitamin, which is vitamin M, also called vitamin B9. It's a water-soluble vitamin. It's called folic acid, and it's physically present in the human body in different forms. And you can see the forms there. You don't have to know the formula, so don't worry about it. But I would appreciate it if you can more or less identify different types of forms. I will show you that with some of the graphs because these forms are really crucial for the bioactivity. It's just the same as with vitamin D and vitamin A. All these compounds need to be converted. All types of examples of bioconversion. And if the conversion doesn't work for one reason or another, you get into problems with vitamin D deficiency or vitamin M deficiency, like in this case. So let's look a little bit to the theory of folic acid. The first thing we know is that it's picked up from the diet, usually from plant-based foods like bread, vegetables. It can be taken up. It's usually absorbed in a free form. So we need an enzyme which is called a conjugase. And the conjugase can split a large chain which is linked to the molecule, which is called polyglutamate. So we just cut it off by the enzyme, and then it's free for absorption either by active transport or by diffusion. There are conjugase inhibitors in the GI tract. So it means that if you eat certain foods that are rich in the inhibitors, you might have a lower bioavailability of folic acid. You can also stimulate it. For example, if you would drink milk, it can stimulate the uptake of folic acid. Milk as such does not contain very high levels of folic acid, but if you would eat in the morning breakfast cereals in combination with milk, then the milk will see that the folic acid from the breakfast cereals is easier absorbed in the body. Let's look at the potential mechanisms. So what does it actually do? It's not easy, I understand, it's quite complex, but it's very important. So I can only say try to understand it, because the problems in Belgium, in Europe, but also in the US are there, and we need strategies to avoid deficiencies. So there are actually 4 key functions, of which the 3 last ones are the real key activities for folic acid. You can see the intermediate names. I can plot them here on the screen. And on the right side, between brackets, you can see where they interfere, why they are important. For the second one, which is called 5,10-methylene tetrahydrofolate, you see here the activity, it's thymidine. And for the third one, which is 5,10-methinyl tetrahydrofolate, the intermediate is purines. So thymidine and purines are starting products for the production of genetic material. So you can understand that if these intermediates are not produced, we cannot produce the basic compounds that are used to make DNA. And this gives serious intervention problems. You will see that immediately. So they're important in genetics in this case. The last reaction is the formation of 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. And this one is linked to the production of methionine, an essential amino acid. And methionine is a donor of methyl groups. And these methyl groups are used to methylate DNA. So we're talking here about epigenetics, not about genetics, but epigenetics. So it means that the DNA is actually further modified by the use of methylation reactions. And this is important because nutrition can influence epigenetic processes. So it can influence, in this case, methylation patterns of the DNA. This is the scheme. So don't panic. I know it's a complex scheme. You don't have to reproduce it all. I'm just telling you, try to say in a few words the most important parts from that figure, and then I will accept that. So the most important parts are the tetrahydrofolate. So here in the cycle is the starting molecule of folic acid. So from folic acid, you go into tetrahydrofolate, which is a reduction reaction. You add hydroxyl atoms. This tetrahydrofolate will be converted on the left side to the bottom to 5,10-methylene tetrahydrofolate. And from there, you go up to 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. So it's the same as the starting molecule, but it just contains one methyl group at position number 5. And then you convert the 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate back into tetrahydrofolate by the release of the methyl group. So in other words, folic acid or tetrahydrofolate is a donor of methyl groups in the overall metabolism. The methyl group goes to homocysteine, and with this you produce methionine. The conversion into methionine is catalyzed by B12. So you see that folic acid and vitamin B12 very closely work together. If you have a B12 deficiency, you might have also a problem with folic acid metabolism, which means that there is no methylation of DNA, which can lead to some metabolic disturbances. Or if you're low in folate, but enough B12, then you also don't supply the methyl groups, And you again get in problems with making methionine that is responsible for methylation of DNA. And so all epigenetic pathways are linked with this small triangle here on the left side, which is both dependent from folic acid intermediates as well as from B12. The bottom intermediates on the right side here, the forminino derivatives and formyl derivatives, all of these are linked to production of thymidine and purine databases. So if you don't have intermediates that are used, building blocks that can be used for production of genetic material, you cannot produce any DNA, which also means that you get into metabolic disorders. And the disorder that we're talking about here, in case you have no DNA production, is of course the problem with neural tube defects. And we abbreviate that as NTD. Neural tube defects means that young children are born with an open back. And this is due to the absence of folate at the start of the pregnancy. So females who would like to become pregnant, or females that are pregnant for the first 3 months of pregnancy, need to have an optimal folate status. If the folate status is not optimal, you get these genetic defects at genetic level. I explained to you the mechanism. And this means that we don't have a closure of the neural tube, and we get neural tube defects, which is practically speaking being born with an open back. And in those situations, you need an operation to correct for that. So it's a serious malformation, and in order to avoid it, you need to have an optimal folate status. So I hope that the mechanism is clear. It's a very important process in human nutrition. A few words about vitamin B12, a very complex molecule. You can see here the structure. You don't have to know it. Just remember that there's a cobalt in the center. So this is also already discussed with the trace elements. So this is a bit the key feature of B12, who normally accepts the methyl group from folate and brings it to methionine. So brings it to homocysteine for the production of methionine. And that methionine is then used in epigenetic processes. B12 can only be produced by microbial synthesis. It could be produced in the colon, but it's not well absorbed. So it means that we can easily get a deficiency if there's no vitamin B12 in the food. It's usually taken in animal-based foods, but if you are a vegetarian and especially a veganist, you might run in troubles because there's not enough B12 coming in. B12 is also very sensitive for acids. So in order to bring it through the stomach, we need some proteins, and finally it needs to be bound to intrinsic factor that then can see that the B12 is absorbed in the small intestine. Once it's absorbed, it can be transported by transcobalamines, which are probably also compounds that could be used to measure the vitamin B12 status. And then for the functions, again, I think I already explained to you how the functions work. We already explained that it is a donor of methyl groups, which could be used further in the process of methionine production and epigenetics. Creatine is also an intermediate compound there, but everything is a little bit linked with the methylation of the DNA, and this is linked to several metabolic processes. I think there B12 is the key factor. There's a second potential function. I'm not sure if it is that much importance, but if there's no B12 in the diet and you're low in B12 status, then it seems that some rare fatty acids will accumulate and they will be converted into malonyl-CoAs, which mainly be determined by the urine. So you could release degradation products of malonyl-CoA that could be measured by a urinary test. So remember from B12, the strong interaction with folic acid, the role in donating methyl groups to methionine, and the role it can play to epigenetic processes in human metabolism. Here you can see the status for B12. So we have omnivores who eat animal-based foods, the vegetarians who don't eat meat and fish, but they can eat milk, eggs. So there is some intermediates there. And we have the veganists who are only focusing on plant-based foods. So no eggs, no milk, no fish, and no meat. And you can see here the average serum concentrations. The white horizontal line at 150 stands for the ideal levels in the plasma. And you can see that only the omnivores are a little bit in the safe case. The vegetarians, part of them are okay because don't remember this is a mean value, so there is a curvature around it. Half of the vegetarians might be in trouble. And if we look to the veganists, then you can see that the mean value is below the recommended line. So in this case, we could say that the majority of the veganists do not have an optimal B12 status, and they should rely on taking supplements to compensate for that. So the final question is, for this story, what are we going to do now? Because you know there's a problem with folic acid in B12. You could think about a strategy to correct this. There's a big difference because I must say that at the governmental levels, there have been many discussions on what has to be done. Finally, the discussion and the final result is different for the US versus the European context. And there's a mean difference in strategy in order to avoid neural tube defects in young children. And the reason why there's a difference, you can actually see on this slide. So on that slide, if we start on the left bottom, you can see synthetic folic acid, F. It means that if you have such a large-scale intervention, and you want to treat the whole population, in that case, you need enough vitamin. And the vitamin we have here is folic acid that is produced in a synthetic way. And so by chemical processes, you can just synthesize folic acid. You can put it in a tablet and you can give it to people. So if you give it like that, the synthetic folic acid will be converted into the natural folic acid that you can see on the right. So this is the 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. And this natural folic acid will help in methionine synthesis, lowering of homocysteine. So it means that it contributes to the normal processes of folic acid. So that's what we want. But we also understand now that when you systematically supply folic acid at a dose which is higher than 400 micrograms per day, in those situations, the conversion process gets saturated. So it means that we don't have natural folic acid, but we have accumulation of synthetic folic acid. And this synthetic folic acid will then accumulate in the blood, will compete with the natural folate, and will influence methionine or DNA synthesis. So it's not a healthy condition to have high levels of synthetic folic acid circulating in the blood. We don't want that. For those reasons, Europe has decided not to add folic acid to basic staple foods. So what we do in Europe is that if you belong to the target group, so you are, for example, a young woman and you would like to become pregnant, then you contact your medical doctor, you discuss the issue with your medical doctor. If you are folate deficient, then they will prescribe for you folic supplements with the idea of taking a specific supplement to correct for that. And in this way, all the other people in the society who are not confronted with the problem will not get too high intakes of synthetic folic acid. In the US, the situation is different. There, folic acid, synthetic folic acid, is added to basic staples, especially to flours, which can then be used to produce all types of products. So the whole population there, independent on whether you're a target group or not, will receive more synthetic folic acid. Supplement use does not have to be used in this situation, but of course there is a risk that some people take in too much. And in order to check that, there is a regular follow-up in the whole population. Yeah, so they follow up the situation to see if some specific problems occur or not. And so you see that the risk-benefit discussion and the way you solve the problem is completely different from region to region in the world. If you are interested in the topic, you can go to EUFORA. There's an article there from Van Gol, published in 2018, that gives you more or less the situation of folate in Europe, the problems it faces, and also the way they treated it. And I think this curvature from that article, is quite important. On the x-axis, you can see the number of weeks that a woman who would like to become pregnant received a supplement of synthetic folic acid of 400 micrograms per day. On the y-axis, you can see the level of folate in the red blood cells expressed in micromoles per liter. The ideal concentration is 1000 micromoles per liter. If you reach that level, we can assume that the risk for obtaining neural tube defects is low. And all the numbers that you see are studies that were done, that were published in literature before and after giving the supplements to see how fast folate levels increase in the blood after giving the supplements. So if we start at 0 weeks before the supplementation, for all the intervention groups, you can see that the levels are lower than 1000, which again clearly illustrates that females living in Europe have a low intake or a low status of folic acid that is needed, that could give a certain risk for neural tube defects. I'm not saying that there will be neural tube defects, but the risk is increased when the levels are low in the blood. And then when you go to the right, you can see all these numbers. This means that there is the improvement in the status in folate. But you can see that in some countries, some studies, like for example here, study number 5, or is it 3? No, number 5. You can see that it takes about 4 to 8 weeks, which is 2 months, to get an optimal status. And if we take even study number 7, then you can see that it can take up to 20 weeks before the ideal status is reached. And 20 weeks, this corresponds to 5 months. So if a female would like to become pregnant, you have to think ahead more than 4 months, so 5 months ahead, in order to be sure that you reach the optimal status at the start of pregnancy. Okay, about B12, I cannot say too much about the intervention. It's quite simple. The most logical way of working is by giving B12 supplements. So these supplements do not cause a serious risk for toxicity. So even if you would take in a little bit too much B12, there is not any indication that it gives you serious malformations or problems. But of course, it's best not to take too much risk on that. So if you take supplements, just take a supplement at a dose that corresponds to the real requirements. So the requirement is defined. It's there. I don't know it by heart, but you can check it. And if you just take one supplement that corresponds to the daily dose, in principle, that should be okay for B12. If you do not want to take supplements, but you are a veganist and you would like to stick to plant-based foods, I think there's only one option you can do, and that's going for fermented foods, because vitamin B12 can be produced by fermentation. So you could take, for example, a soy-based product or anything like that. You ferment it, and then there is some B12 produced. But since we don't have many products like that on the market, probably the chances of having enough B12 is quite low in those situations. Okay, I think with these you had the 4 most important vitamins: vitamin A, vitamin D, folic acid, and vitamin B12. So we now go for smaller things that are still relevant to talk about because there are problems occurring. The first one is vitamin E. Tocopherols is a fat-soluble vitamin that is an antioxidant. No problems for deficiency today, but the major problem is fortifying or giving extra supplements of vitamin E. And if there's too much in the body circulating, you might break it down. You see here some reactions. You might break it down to better water-soluble components, but it's a very complex process. And so potentially also vitamin E could lead to toxicity at high intakes. So please be careful with that. The same for vitamin C. Vitamin C is a very popular supplement. It's used quite often. People say, I don't want to get sick, so I need to have an extra supplement of vitamin C. And vitamin C is known to be an antioxidant. It can oxidize, it can reduce. You can see here some formulas. So ascorbic acid turns into dehydroascorbate by reduction, and this dehydroascorbate can go back into ascorbic acid by the use of glutathione. That you might still remember, it's the sulfur component that we discussed with the minerals. Dehydroascorbate in very high quantities will go into gulonic acid. And gulonic acid is the starting molecule for oxalic acid, and oxalic acid can give you kidney stones. So if you would consume mega doses of vitamin C, 500 milligrams a day, for example, high dosing, and you keep that for a long period of time, so chronological supply, you might run in problems with kidney stone formation. And so also water-soluble vitamins could have some negative effects. The same for folic acid. So please be careful, don't overdose with fat as well as water-soluble vitamins. We know deficiency for vitamin C, it's scurvy. I think I discussed that already with you in one of the first lectures of this course. It's linked to connective tissue, collagen formation. Vitamin C is responsible for activating the enzymes that are responsible for collagen. And if you don't have vitamin C, there's no collagen formation. You get disturbances in the formation of connecting tissue, and this leads to bleedings, for example, near the teeth or around the fingers. If we have high intakes of vitamin C, so like 500 milligrams of vitamin C, then you see on this slide, which is a study done in Nature, you can find it back online if you want to read it yourself. They took blood samples, they isolated the red blood cells, they took the DNA from there, and they saw that DNA can be damaged, can be oxidized at very high levels of vitamin C. And so you see that here on the third and the fourth bar graph. So the oxyadenine is produced in higher quantities after the supplementation. And if you go back to the washout, then you can see the reverse goes back to normal. And so there are pro-oxidative effects occurring at very high intake levels of vitamin C. And this brings me to the last vitamin. Yeah, so we're almost there. The last vitamin is vitamin K. K stands for coagulation. And I can already say that this vitamin is important. You can see that in the middle slide here, to add CO2 in the form of carboxyl groups to proteins. So you get a protein, you add a CO2 group, and then the group gets negatively charged and can bind to calcium. So the calcium binding properties are increased by the use of vitamin K. And this is important for blood coagulation because in this way you can actually coagulate blood by making these cross-links with calcium. The second thing that you need to understand is that there could be deficiency, especially for people who have a disturbed microbial flora in the colon. This is the case with very young infants because the flora is not yet optimized, but it could also be a problem with people that have disturbances in the microbiota. And so in those situations, B12 is a problem. If the microbiota is working in the ideal case, then in principle, you have enough intake and supply of vitamin K. And here an example of how it works. So the vitamin K catalyzes the uptake of CO2 inside the protein so that the calcium binding properties of the protein increases, like for example in blood coagulation. And then the epoxide form of the vitamin K can be regenerated into the original dihydroxy form by the use of a couple of reactions. So if you block these reactions, like anticoagulants, for example, then the blood will not clot because there's no regeneration of vitamin K in the system. A little bit technical information, but if you know that it has disturbances with the microbiota, and that there are some target groups like people with disturbances in microbiota or young infants, then you will know that vitamin K could be relevant.